So hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on building resilience into your innovation portfolio. This webinar will cover and build upon some of the ideas that Dave and I have been writing about over the past couple of years on the topic of innovation portfolio management. Now, for those of you who don't know Innosight, we are a growth strategy consulting firm that was founded a little over 20 years ago by our colleagues Mark Johnson and the late great Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen. Our mission is to empower forward-thinking organizations to navigate disruptive change and own the future. Over the past few months, one of the most urgent questions that we have been hearing companies ask is, in the face of rising inflation, distressed supply chains, and general market disruptions, how can we make sure that we are making the right investments in growth and innovation? Now, back in early 2020, pre-COVID times, companies may have had a good set of projects, a number of smart initiatives, but now with all that's going on, we're finding that an increasing number of companies are struggling to prioritize where they want to place those investments. In this webinar, we will share our approach for how to address this challenge. My name is Alistair Trotter, and I will be one of your MCs for the webinar. I've been a part of the Innosight team since 2006, and I lead our financial services and innovation capabilities practice. And I am joined today with my fabulous colleague, Dave Duncan, who will be co-presenting with me. Dave, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Dave Duncan, also work a lot on this topic of innovation capabilities, and happy to be with you today.
Excellent. So before we begin, perhaps I'll just cover a few quick housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded, and the link, Fernanda, to the recorded webinar and the presentation slides will be shared. We'll make sure that gets to you all via email. We have muted all lines. There's a number of folks today, so that would be chaos if we didn't do that. So we'll ask that you please submit questions using the Q&A function that appears in the toolbar on your screen. You can try to put them in the chat window. We'll do our best to capture those, but the Q&A function makes it a little easier, as we will try to leave some time at the end to work through questions that have been lined up. We also have a couple of poll questions. We'll kick off with one of those in just a moment. Please make sure that once you've selected the radio button for your answer, you actually hit the submit button. Otherwise, we will not see your vote. And as I mentioned, feel free to comment away in the chat. We already see some of you doing so. I'll ask Dave to moderate the chat while I'm talking, and vice versa, and we will do our best to respond in real time or save up answers for the end. So with that, let us kick off our first poll question, which is just, we'd love to understand why you are here today. A range of possible answers. It may be that none of the answers fits exactly what you are, describes your case, in which case you can feel free to type in a different answer into the chat window. But let me go ahead and kick off the first poll question. Why are you here today? I'll give it about another 10 seconds because people are clicking quickly. So we're seeing a good number of results, and I think it's starting to slow down. So I'm just going to go and end the poll there and share the results.
So I think it's encouraging that at least everybody has an idea of why they're here today.
Yes.
So,
well, I feel like we didn't want to have leading questions. So I figured I put in, I have no idea at the end. But good to see no one clicked it. So excited to see there's a few people who've even read the ebooks. That shows some passion for the topic. And not surprised to see the answers split across people who are involved in innovation. That's obviously, Innosight's heritage. Has been working closely with people who have innovation in their role and title. And more recently, we've been spending a lot of time thinking about portfolio management. So excited to see a number of you recognize that this is a challenge for many organizations, and particularly when times are changing as they are today. So with that, just to get us started, I'd love to pass to Dave really to help us perhaps set a little context for this idea of strategic portfolio management and why we're here today.
Great, thanks, Alistair. So as Alistair just mentioned, the big question that companies are really always asking, but they're asking it, I'd say, more urgently in recent times, is how can we make sure that we're making the right investments in growth and in innovation, particularly in light of all of the huge changes going on in the world over the last couple of years. Our answer to this is the subject of this webinar, Strategic Portfolio Management. But before we get into the solution, I'll just say a few more words about the nature of the problem that it is aimed to solve. So consider that every organization out there has at any point in time a number of goals that it's trying to accomplish. It might be trying to enter new markets. It might be trying to hit its near-term growth and EBIT targets, develop new sources of growth, navigate big workforce changes like people working from home or hybrid workforces, responding to emerging disruptions and so on. But there's going to be a set of goals at any given point in time, and achieving those goals are how that organization as a whole defines success. But to do that, it typically requires all parts of the organization to be working together, coordinating, collaborating effectively and efficiently. And this is where the difficulties arise. So companies are by nature siloed, with each silo focusing on its own goals, the projects that it's responsible for, that piece of the bigger picture. And that specialization is part of why modern organizations are so effective, because you can really have people focus on what they're great at. But that creates challenges. Each silo might be behaving rationally in its own context, executing very well on its own projects, but it's often the case that if you look collectively at what all those silos are doing, they're often not pursuing the best aggregate set of projects or portfolio projects to achieve the organization's aggregate goals, or doing so in a coordinated and resource efficient way. And there's a bunch of reasons this can happen. It includes, simply lacking visibility into everything that the org is doing across silos. There often isn't a way for leaders at the top to see everything that's going on in the organization. We often hear them say that with respect to innovation in particular. They know there's a lot of innovation happening. It seems to be good, but they couldn't tell you at any one time everything that's happening, and importantly, how resources are balanced against that. And there's just no way for them to pull out a digestible view of that. And then secondly, there might be a lack of insight, even if there is visibility into what's happening at a portfolio level, that would enable those leaders to understand how well positioned they are to achieve the organization's goals. And then finally, if you do have visibility, if you do have insight, these portfolio level insights are often not fed into governance and decision-making processes and forums for taking those portfolio insights and making decisions about how to rebalance or modify the portfolio to have a better chance of achieving your goals. All of those problems we see in just about every big organization that we encounter, and they've been exacerbated over the last couple of years when the pace of change seems to have accelerated a lot of unexpected developments that people need to be agile and respond to as they do that. So our answer to how you solve this challenge is strategic portfolio management. Why don't we go to the next slide, Alistair, and we'll put a little bit more definition on what we mean by that. So we define strategic portfolio management as a discipline that enables you to look across silos in an organization. You can dynamically in real time look across those silos, gather the information around what you're doing, so you can answer these three fundamental questions that are relevant to every portfolio of every kind, and then use those answers to make better decisions about where you want to focus your investments. What do you want to start, stop, accelerate, or continue? The three questions are these. So first of all, are we doing the right things, right? Are the projects that we're working on the right ones? Secondly, are we doing the right amount of those things? Are we doing too much, too little, or just the right amount? And then thirdly, as we're pursuing those right things at the right scale, have we optimized how our resources are allocated to them? And we're going to dig into each of these questions, how you might answer it in turn. But it's important to note that although we've framed this webinar around the innovation portfolio and how you can build a more resilient innovation portfolio, it really applies to any kind of portfolio. It could be the strategic portfolio of the organization as a whole. It could be a narrower portfolio within a particular technology group or product area, but all of these techniques apply as we go through this. So why don't we then move on to the next slide, which is what are the 4 steps for strategic portfolio management? This is how we're going to organize the rest of this webinar. So step 1 is you have to define what portfolio you want to manage, right? If your goal is to manage a portfolio strategically, you have to be specific about which portfolio it is. And then what projects or initiatives do you want to consider as part of that portfolio? Second step is you have to clarify then what performance goals you want that portfolio to achieve. What does it need to solve for? What goals or metrics are you going to use to evaluate whether or not the portfolio is good and that you're going to be managing to? And obviously, this is going to be very much related to the nature of the portfolio of interest. So those 2 steps are closely related. Thirdly, you're going to want to develop insights into that portfolio by constructing what we call portfolio views. These are different ways of looking at a collection of projects that yield insights into how well that collection is performing relative to the goals that you've defined for it. And then finally, you want to use those insights that you've unearthed to make decisions. Without leaders making decisions, taking actions on those insights, then the exercise is just really just an interesting discussion. But the power of portfolio management as a capability lies in linking those insights with resource allocation and strategy decisions. And we're going to cover each of these steps in detail. I'll quickly go through the first 2, and then we'll spend probably a disproportionate amount of our time on steps 3 and 4, where some of the, I think, the newer ideas are situated in this webinar. All right, let's dive into step 1. So step 1 is to define the portfolio you want to manage. And first of all, why don't we define what we mean by a portfolio? We have a very broad definition of it, which is any set of projects that meet some set of screening criteria. So they're similar in some nature, and they're all oriented towards some set of goal that you've defined. And importantly, not just one of those projects is required to achieve that goal you've defined, but you need the whole aggregate set of projects. And so to define the portfolio you want to manage, it starts with getting really clear on what type of business problem you're going to solve, as the relevant portfolio is going to be a function of that problem. So we worked, for example, with a global financial services firm a few years ago. They had a very ambitious 5-year revenue target. They knew that a lot of that growth had to come from innovation, things that they hadn't necessarily contemplated yet. New types of products, new types of business models were going to be critical to meet that growth. And so they decided they wanted to define what they called their growth innovation portfolio. And these would be projects that would generate revenue in the 2 to 5 year time frame. And they gave it a name. They figured out what went in the portfolio as a way to highlight it and manage it more carefully against that ambitious strategic growth goal. That's just one example of a portfolio. You might have a different type of goal. You might want to create a better experience for your customers in some area of your business and define your customer experience portfolio as a set of projects that are oriented towards achieving that objective. You might have an expense reduction goal across your whole organization and define a portfolio of expense-related initiatives that you want to track and manage. Oftentimes, we see organizations that are trying to drive some big transformation in their mix of businesses and their operating model, define a portfolio of transformation-related initiatives and projects, and that'll be the thing they want to measure and manage. But what all of those have in common is they're all oriented towards a specific goal or set of goals, and they contain multiple projects that in principle are all oriented towards those goals and that cumulatively have to work together to achieve them. It's really important. The whole topic of this webinar is this idea of how do you measure and manage an aggregate set of things, right, as opposed to one specific narrow project. Now, once you've defined the general purpose of your portfolio, the next step is to establish what criteria you're going to use for what goes in and out of it, right? You need to decide, is it 10 projects, 20 projects, 500 projects, right? And you do that by saying, we're going to screen for projects that look like this. And obviously, the nature of those screening criteria, again, are going to be related to the goals you have. If it's a growth innovation portfolio, you might specify the types of innovations that you want to track. You might be less interested in core what Clay Christensen called sustaining innovations, and more interested in new product or transformational types of innovations. So that might be a screening criteria you have for an innovation portfolio. Certainly, you're going to have things like thresholds of significance, because it seems like a fairly straightforward step maybe when you first hear about it, but it's actually surprisingly tricky to figure out what goes in and what goes out of any particular portfolio, and to establish kind of black and white criteria for that. And what you don't want is to have 100 projects, 500 projects in a portfolio, because then it becomes unwieldy to be able to manage and measure. So as you establish thresholds for what goes in and out, you want to think about a target set of far fewer projects. And Alistair, it looks like you're about to jump in and say something insightful.
I wasn't, but now that you've called on me, the point I guess I'd make to build on that would be it's not just a matter of is it in the portfolio or out, it's should the company do it or not. And so when portfolio management is done well as a discipline, right, the idea, one of the principles behind it is you'd rather have one project delivering the results versus 10, or better, 10 projects rather than 100. And a lot of organizations fall into the trap of incrementalism, is lots of small efforts, not thinking big enough about a couple of needle moving projects. And so when you do portfolio management correctly, we tend to find that companies start getting better at eliminating lots of small overlapping projects which aren't really going to help, and instead trying to repurpose those resources towards the few that will actually make the difference.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'll just add one other, I'd say, design principle as you think about what goes in and out, is you want to make sure that the group of people that are going to be overseeing this portfolio are the ones who are empowered to take action on making adjustments to it. And I'd say this is a key constraint for what you decide is going to go in the portfolio that your portfolio management function is going to manage, that you've got a group of people that can actually make decisions about whether they want to dial up or dial down resources, add or subtract something from the portfolio. Because the last thing you want to do is set up a new kind of governance structure for some portfolio with a group over it that doesn't actually have control over it. Right, so that's step one. Step two, right, now that you've defined your portfolio and you know why you're trying to manage it, what's included and what's not, the next step is to align on the goals for that portfolio specifically. We all know that what gets measured gets managed. So if you want your portfolio to deliver against those goals, you have to get very specific about what the attributes are of the ideal portfolio. What does good look like? What's the standard against which you're going to manage it? And again, I'll just emphasize, I'll probably sound like a broken record. These are performance goals, not for those individual projects in the portfolio, but for what you need it to do as a whole, the collective set of projects. On this slide, we've illustrated some of the target types of portfolio attributes you might specify. This is a disguised example from another client we worked on a few years ago that was also looking at growth-oriented innovation as a portfolio. And these are some of the criteria they came up with to describe what good looks like for their portfolio, what they were going to try to manage it to solve for. So in terms of the right kinds of innovation, right, you might define things like what are the risk profiles of the mix of things that you want to work on. You want to have some bets in the core, maybe a preponderance of your investment goes in the core, but you also want to have some investment in adjacent, more transformational types of things, and you have a desired risk profile you're trying to manage to. Certainly, you're going to be thinking about, well, does this align with my strategic priorities? And importantly, there might be a few very specific, recent emerging competitive threats, maybe a new type of competitor has come in and disrupted your business, and you know that your innovation portfolio has to include something that enables you to respond agilely to that or effectively to that. Similarly, with maybe a recent regulatory change, these are all things you might define in the realm of, are we doing the right kind of projects in our portfolio? To define what enough looks like, are we doing enough or the right amount of things? In the case of this growth portfolio, they were looking at the revenue growth rate over time. And they also wanted to shift their business mix over time from more mature, slowly growing businesses to higher growth ones, because they wanted to impact the multiple, the valuation multiple of the company. And so that was an important thing they wanted to reflect in their portfolio design. And then finally, you want to think about, well, how do we want this to look in terms of the balance of how we're allocating our resources across these different things? One of the relevant things for their innovation portfolio is they wanted to think about the different stages of innovation project development and be able to look at, well, how much stuff do we have that's really early stage and exploratory versus on the other end of the spectrum, it's close to being ready to launch or scale. And we want to make sure that our investment is ramping up appropriately. So we're investing less in the early stages and then more as things in our portfolio get ready to scale. This gives you then a precise sense of what good looks like and what you're trying to solve for with the portfolio. So Alistair, anything you would add here before we move on to the next step?
No, I think we covered it. I think we can jump into the next step.
Great. So step 3, and this is where I think it gets more interesting, right? Once you have your portfolio defined, you know what's going to include in it, you know what it's supposed to solve for. The next step is to develop what we call portfolio views, which give you insight at the aggregate level to inform decision making. And there's lots of different views you could generate, and this slide just shows a few of them that you might generate to answer each of these 3 big portfolio questions. But Alistair, I'm going to turn it over to him to go through some of the more interesting ones and some of the things that we've learned about generating these views as we've worked on this with various clients.
Excellent. So this is where we get to return to those 3 questions that are at the heart of often, frankly, how our conversations with clients begin. It's along the lines of we think we're doing enough, but we're not sure. In fact, I saw a question pop up in the Q&A just now, which sort of gets at one of these in part, which is, well, how do you determine the percentage of sustaining versus transformational projects in portfolio management? So thanks to Nathan to that question. At the heart of this is a strategic set of questions around, what does the organization want to be 3, 4, 5 years in the future? What is the revenue that you need to generate beyond your core or within your core? What is the product strategies that you need to deliver upon? Who are the customers you wish to serve? And coming out of those strategy questions are the answers to the innovation priorities, going after certain customer groups, developing certain types of competitive responses, entering new markets, launching new different types of business models. But that once you then have this portfolio of projects designed to respond to each of those strategic imperatives, then you have to get to these specific questions, which is, well, now we know what our North Star is for how much revenue we might want to generate a few years out, or how many customers we want to serve. You can start to evaluate the portfolio in real time to say, well, are we on track to where we need to be? Now, in this third step, where we talk about portfolio views, we're going to be treating this as a one-time portfolio analysis. So the idea is, how do we do an analysis of our portfolio in order to figure out whether we're on track to deliver against our long-term strategic objectives? Toward the end of the discussion, we'll then shift the conversation to say, okay, if you don't want to do this just once, how do you actually build the capability to dynamically manage that portfolio over time? We'll go there. But for now, we can consider the next 20 minutes or so as focused on really the views that one would use, regardless of whether it is a one-time analysis or an ongoing capability. And as noted, that goes back to these 3 questions. So we'll start with question number 1, which is, are we doing the right kinds of innovation? Now, before I show the portfolio view, let's briefly discuss what we mean by the right kinds of innovation. Innovation is always a means to an end, right? So supporting the right kinds of innovation means that your innovation investments ought to support clear strategic priorities. Right, as Dave mentioned earlier, our priorities might need to innovate the customer experience or increase productivity, perhaps deploy new business models, create new sources of revenue, make progress against ESG targets. These are all examples of strategic priorities against which you now need to align your portfolio. Now, we'll talk a lot more about how you establish those strategic priorities in an upcoming book and webinar Dave are doing around innovation priorities. Now, the right kinds of innovation can also mean that we're doing the right balance of risk, right? So the balance of core, adjacent, and transformative innovations in your portfolio. There are strategic reasons for wanting a blend of all 3 in an enterprise portfolio, but the ratio of each should be a deliberate choice for any company, and it's something that can be tracked over time to ensure that your portfolio is aligned with your intent. The more direct answer to the question that was asked is, there is no perfect ratio of those 3 different types of innovation. there's a great paper, I want to say, by Jeff Tuff and Bansi Naji, a number of years ago in HBR on managing your innovation portfolio that asserted a ratio, I think, of 70-20-10 for core, adjacent, transformative. And looking at by different industry, I'd say that's a useful heuristic, but really you need to work ground up from the revenue goals or whatever your performance targets are back toward the type of projects that have the characteristics and the risk profiles that you need for your organization. But as a starting point, I think it's a helpful rule of thumb. So this portfolio view we have on screen is one of a series that was prepared for a multinational software company for whom one relevant question was, is our portfolio aligned with our strategic imperatives, given where the world is heading? They had, in advance of this project, defined a set of strategic priorities. And they had brilliant people, PhDs, scientists, engineers, who worked in a variety of innovation labs, innovation centers, even directly in business units. And they were always coming up with interesting new ideas. But the leadership team was worried that projects were emerging, being worked on and funded, which were inconsistent with or even a distraction from the long-term priorities of the leadership team. This is something that's very common in either siloed or heavily decentralized organizations. So for this portfolio view, the portfolio included all projects that had been worked on by at least one FTE for at least 6 months. That was the threshold inclusion criteria. And the performance goals for the portfolio were about ensuring a high level of consistency between those strategic priorities and actually where the investments were being made across the full portfolio. So let's look at the chart in a bit more detail. Each rectangle in each of those columns represents one project in the portfolio. And the height of each of those little boxes represents the level of in-year investment in that project. So cumulatively, you can see the sort of total investment across the organization in projects that met that criteria. Now, along the x-axis, we have 5 strategic imperatives that the organization had newly identified as being critical to drive long-term growth. Now, the boxes stack. So if you look at, column A, you can see that the organization was investing nearly $75 million in projects aligned with that particular strategic imperative. So what happened when we put this portfolio view in front of the leadership team? Well, first, they immediately realized that they were underinvesting in 2 of their strategic priorities, B and D. And that triggered an immediate conversation about how they should free up funds to drive additional project volume against those priorities. Second, the team was intrigued by the set of 4 projects that weren't aligned against any priority. Now, 2 of these projects were actually inside the same business unit, one which had a lower growth rate than its peers. And in fact, the team realized that this BU needed to identify more transformational projects in order to drive growth over the long term. So the team discussed whether these projects had a unifying theme that might actually shed light on a new strategic priority that they'd missed at the enterprise level. But they ultimately decided to defer that decision until the annual planning cycle. So hopefully that just, illustrative example gives you a flavor of one type of portfolio view that allows for an informed discussion supported by analysis of real data into the question, are we investing behind what we said we wanted to invest in from a strategic perspective?
Yeah, let's add one quick point. It's probably obvious, but these types of pictures don't generate themselves. Right? So this is not, and that I think is the point behind thinking about portfolio management as a discipline and capability to build. Right. This is a picture of the aggregate, alignment of the projects in this particular portfolio with strategy, and without making an intentional choice to generate this picture, it wouldn't naturally get generated in the course of, say, strategic planning meetings where each of the little boxes on here, or set of boxes, might march in and give a presentation to the leadership team, but you wouldn't have this view of the big picture. And that's why these views are so valuable.
Yeah, luckily gathering data on spend is usually one of the easier ones. People tend to track that relatively closely. There's people who live and die by those numbers. As you start to get other types of analysis, it can get really interesting. For example, there's a chart that went with this one for this client, which was actually who was working on it. They wanted to see where their PhDs, engineers, and they wanted to do things like cumulative FTRs against each project, because they were struggling with the idea that some people might work part-time in a project and there might be 10 of them, versus another project would have 2 people, but they were working, 80% of their time on it. And so they asked us to go in and develop a point of view about that. That was not data that was lying around. They didn't have a sort of, workforce, ERM type system that would allow them to track that data. So we had to go generate the data to create it. And it's another build on Dave's point, which is, as you do these types of exercises, once you've figured out the question you want to ask that would actually give you the right type of insights to make better decisions, you now have to go figure out how do you generate that data in an ongoing basis to give you visibility into what's going on in the organization. And that can often be a large part of the portfolio management challenge, is actually not just asking good questions, but having the data to answer them. So as you think about this type of a view, what we have noticed over the years of doing this is you tend to see some pretty common patterns emerge. So, one common pattern that we think of as, the outside the box pattern, and you saw a little bit of this in the last view, is you see a large number of initiatives which are outside of stated priorities. This is a common pattern in organizations which have seen or are seeing a sudden change in strategy, whether it's driven by external factors like a pandemic, or a significant move by a competitor, or by internal factors like the deployment of a new strategy. The fix, is probably not surprising, and it's to move quickly to identify the list of non-aligned projects and then make decisions about which ones should be shut down, or whether in fact this is your early warning system from a decentralized organization that's telling you that there's a strategic priority that's being spotted, in the local markets, and it needs to be brought to the attention of perhaps a central strategy group that there really is an opportunity here that is not codified or recognized at the corporate center. The second pattern we often see is this sort of all in. And again, you saw elements of that on strategic priority A in the last view. And this is where you see one imperative and its associated projects absorbing the lion's share of resources. We see this a lot in organizations where there has also been a relatively recent strategy change and an oversteering of resources into the new imperative. And it can also be an indicator that the organization simply sees it as a lot easier to pursue initiatives here, perhaps because the organization already deeply understands that customer, already has that channel, already has a relevant platform. The fix here, if indeed one is required, is simply to ensure that the imbalances are understood and acceptable, with reallocation of resources being a choice open to the team if there is in fact a disconnect. The third common pattern would be the missing link, where there is significant underinvestment in a stated priority. Not uncommon when there's a new priority or a harder priority, and can easily be addressed once it's brought to the attention of leaders who can take appropriate action to either identify new resources for investment, or perhaps deprioritizing certain smaller, less strategic initiatives against other priorities. So that's just some thoughts on this first question, which is, are we doing the right things? The second question, where we like to focus...
Alistair, maybe before you go on, there was a related question in the Q&A. Were the strategic priorities already defined? Were the priorities already defined, or did you need to classify the projects and then align them? I think I'm understanding that question correctly. In the case that we were describing just now, they were, although it's often the case that they're only partially defined, or perhaps not everybody understands what the priorities are in the same way. So there is a little bit of iteration that this exercise often forces in terms of how you describe what the priorities are, so that you can classify things accurately. This really forces you to get pretty sharp on your definition of what your strategic priorities are, and to align everybody on those definitions.
Very much. Yeah, it's hard to avoid the question of what is your innovation strategy, or indeed the question of what is your enterprise strategy when you start tackling portfolio management, given that portfolio management is about how to manage the aggregate set of projects to deliver against the required outcomes of the enterprise strategy or the innovation strategy. So very much a way in there. So to the second view, are we doing too much, too little, or the right amount of things, whether that's innovation or growth projects or otherwise? So before I show you The second view, a little context. This is from a real example with some standardization from a series of portfolio reviews that we conducted a year or two back for one of the larger business units of a large multinational. It was a business unit that was, this company had many, many business units serving B2B, B2C. It had many geographies, different continents, and hundreds of projects, most of which were invisible to the senior leaders in the organization, even in each region, certainly at the global level. So the portfolio that was of interest in this case was what they called the needle movers, this just sort of strategic long-term growth portfolio of those projects that truly would drive meaningful revenue growth over a 5-year period. And it's important to note that this was for one business unit particularly. So the performance goals for this portfolio were understandably focused on revenue generation, and in particular, new sources of revenue, given that the core business unit, the core business model in this business unit was one where leaders were increasingly concerned about slowing growth and disruption in that market. In fact, this business unit had established a very clear target for 2025, and more specifically, a specific revenue target that they wanted from this portfolio of needle-moving initiatives. You'll note, as we discussed, to definitively answer that question, you'll need to dive into the strategy to come up with a number for how much your portfolio is required to deliver. And that's all about the question of long-term growth required for a company and what the core can deliver and versus what you're relying on innovation or new growth to deliver. We're not going to go into that in great depth. We're just going to take as given that there was a revenue number that had been determined for this portfolio. So let me show you the view now and walk you through what you're looking at. First, each bubble represents a single project. And this analysis, based on the thresholds that we defined and the inclusion criteria, had 25 such projects. The size of each of those bubbles represents a risk-adjusted steady state revenue as estimated back then for the year 2025. So here's the steady state revenue in 2025. And by risk-adjusted, I mean early stage gets a haircut if it's an early stage. So essentially consider it the expected value of those revenues. So it's the assessment of what revenues could be using, art of the possible thinking, and recognize they are projections. The vertical axis on our Y here shows the total addressable market. And for simplicity, rather than showing a continuous scale, we've clustered the projects into 4 rows of increasing market size. And then finally, the horizontal axis shows the approximate time until the innovation team believed that they could be in market and thus driving revenues. So if you look at a given project, let's take project X there, right in the center at the top. This is clearly a very important project. It is 18 months from being launched, approximately. And it's not only going after a huge addressable market, that's a $500 million plus TAM, but it's also expected to generate pretty significant revenues, despite the fact that we've adjusted revenue expectations on the fact that it's still early in development. So when we showed this view, what happened? Well, we and the leadership team doing the review had 3 observations, each of which led to an action. The first is they realized that there were 4 projects which were still more than 2 years pre-launch, and which, despite going after large markets, as evidenced by the height of the y-axis, those teams were not asserting that they would actually generate large revenues. So they immediately kicked off a project review, assigning one sponsor from the executive team to digging into the team's underlying assumptions behind the revenue projections for those projects, frankly, to determine whether or not that project was worth continued investment. Secondly, they had realized there was another set of projects in the box here on the bottom that were just not going after large enough markets. Even if these projects were successful, they just didn't have the potential to be needle movers for the business's overall revenue trajectory. I mean, sure, they might generate $10, $20 million once scaled, but for $1 billion P&L, looking at a potential threat to its core business model, these were not the type of growth opportunities that were aligned with the sort of strategic priority for the organization. So in response to that, they immediately placed a number of these projects into review, ultimately killing a number of those initiatives. And third, they realized they now had a hole to fill in terms of big projects that would move the needle on top line growth 2-3 years into the future, because they realized that if you added up all the bubbles on this portfolio view, there were simply not enough in the pipeline to meet the portfolio outcome that they had determined, the revenue goal that this portfolio needed to deliver against. So they kicked off another strategic initiative with CEO sponsorship to identify a set of longer term initiatives that would go after large markets and drive the necessary revenues to achieve the 2025 aspiration. When we see this type of view, again, there's some pretty common patterns. None of these will be that surprising in hindsight. The first we affectionately call the Hail Mary, in which you tend to see one or two very large projects in the distant future. We see this quite a lot in organizations facing disruption for the first time in many years, when they underestimate the risk of a failure of a major, often transformative initiative. Obvious fix is to spin up a portfolio of initiatives focused on growth, ideally with a blend of riskier, high reward projects, as well as some that will deliver focused in the short to midterm. Second common pattern would be the sort of incrementalist portfolio, in which you see a large number of small to medium-sized initiatives, but the portfolio lacks any projects that would really move the needle for the business. This is pretty common in companies which have been consistently able to deliver steady growth in the past. And so the pattern's not necessarily concerning, so long as there are no impending threats to the ability of the core business to sustain current growth rates. The fix here, should it be required, is again to seek out, identify new initiatives that would look for greater impact, even if that pushes, and sometimes because it pushes, the organization to explore adjacencies where it might not have looked before. Third common pattern is the unfocused portfolio, characterized by the struggle the leadership team has to actually narrow down the pool of interesting projects into a subset that really matters. This is probably one of the most common patterns, and in very large organizations where you get P&L or functional leaders who are empowered with a really high degree of autonomy, and in organizations where there's so much opportunity that it's genuinely hard to whittle down the set of opportunities and make decisions about where to focus. To address this, it's really important to revisit the strategic context, for example, long-term revenue growth, and then engage in the right leadership discussions to really drill down into where does the business want to be in 5 years? Where are the most compelling opportunities? What type of customers do we want to serve? And what will create the most option value for us? Focus is the key word here. This is an area where people come to us with the symptom of saying we are having a hard time prioritizing. And sometimes it's because they don't have the governance structures to get this done, but actually it's far more common that clarity around strategic priorities is simply lacking. And so portfolio management needs to be supplemented with clarity around the strategy to really address these issues. So one more to go. We've tackled the high-level questions of are we doing the right type of stuff and are we doing enough stuff? Third question is, have we optimized how we are allocating our resources to that stuff, whether it be innovation or the set of products in our growth portfolio? So before we hop into the details of this, maybe a quick other poll on the most common challenge that we often hear from companies related to portfolio management, which is this idea about how do you kill zombie projects? Now, for those of you not familiar with that term, a zombie project is one which, well, really should be dead by now, but for some reason the project is still alive, even though everyone thinks it should probably be put out of its misery. Often it's a mismatch between the people working on the project versus the leadership aspirations for what they hope the project might deliver. But everyone is usually unified in the lower levels of the organization that this is a project that should be killed off. And these projects can limp on for months, even years, consuming resources, causing problems to morale, not to mention the opportunity cost associated with using resources that might be refocused on other higher value projects. So identifying and killing projects before they become zombies is one of the key benefits of performing a strategic portfolio review. So with that, let me just fire off the next poll here. Question number 2, and let's launch that. So the question for you all is, inside your organization, how easy is it on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is very easy and 5 is very hard, to put down nicely with all due celebration, as we would recommend, and then explore the learnings for those projects. All right, I don't think the results are going to change even if I wait another 5 seconds. So let me end the poll there and share the results. Dave, any observations?
Yeah, I guess I would have predicted this. It is very hard to kill a zombie, and there's lots of good reasons for that, in terms of just the commitment people have already made to a particular project. In some cases, it could be a big initiative that a lot of people have a lot invested in terms of years of their lives or time committed to it, and are accountable for it. Or they just sincerely believe that they just need more time to pursue it. But it is a very difficult challenge.
Yeah, fully agree. There's so many, I guess, fallacies that get in the way of doing this. Whether it's the sunk cost fallacy, it makes it hard to tackle this, or it can be sort of the aspiration that this thing might still work if you just keep investing. But where I'd say a lot of these all come home to roost is the fact that people find it hard to kill zombie projects because they don't have the data that supports why they should be killed. Because so often these decisions are highly subjective and based on personalities and politics. One of the huge benefits that we see to portfolio management is the discipline of bringing data, real-time data where at all possible, thoughtful data, often data that is about metrics that you might not think to track, and then putting that in easy to consume dashboards in front of the existing governance structures. That is our perspective on how you address this issue systematically. So let's hop into one way to do that and what that data might actually look like. So this is a view designed to kill zombies. It is from a recent project with a data and analytics firm we worked with. And this portfolio under examination included all in-flight projects that were consuming some more than threshold level of funding. And so the relevant performance goal for this chart was the expected ROI on innovation investments. So let me walk you through the view. As before, each bubble represents one project in the portfolio, with the size of the bubble representing the currently budgeted in-year investment. Horizontal axis here represents the stage of development of the innovation project. The axis here specifically is our pathways methodology, but it looks like any stage gate based approach to come up with ideas, shape solutions, test and learn, and then scale. So if I pick an example project, let's pick W, right center at the top there. You can see that it is still in what we would describe as the pilot phase, and it's been there for nearly 2 years, 25 months. So what were the observations and decisions that this team made? Well, for this particular portfolio view, there was one goal, and 3 projects jumped out as being in what we affectionately describe as the zombie zone. Of course, it's possible that these projects and their teams were just taking their time, but this particular leadership team decided that these 3 projects needed some special care and attention. The executives were highly aware of all 3 projects, but they were surprised by how long they had actually spent in the most recent stage of the process. They had previously perceived each project to be making good progress, but when pushed on exactly what good progress meant, the leadership team quickly realized that these teams were going through the motions, building prototypes, running pilots, but not actually making meaningful advances towards critical milestones. In short, they already were, or were certainly close to becoming zombies. To fix this, each project team was asked to define very clearly what would it take to get to the next stage in the innovation process, and the assumptions that they would need to believe. And now, as an aside note, I'll note that this is often then causes a deep dive into, well, what is the process? What is the stage gate? What are the criteria that allow projects to move? Because unless those are rigorous, you can manipulate projects such that they don't appear in the zombie zone. So it's another common side effect of doing a portfolio analysis, is to bring more scrutiny to stage gate type processes to make sure that the exit criteria are appropriate. Anyway, based on the leadership team's response to these questions, one of the projects was shut down. The other 2 were given very tight leashes and aggressive timelines in order to meaningfully advance the project to the next stage. So that's a very typical response, is putting a clear milestone and a clear timeline against which to meet it. Otherwise, the project will be shut down. There's, as you might imagine, a couple of common patterns. The first, building on our theme here, is World War Z, where you see the infestation of zombie projects. This is actually very common. And unsurprisingly, perhaps to you all, you see this most often right after a change in leadership. When a new leader comes in and says, I'd like a review of all in-flight projects, and often in mind, they are willing to ask tough questions that predecessors hadn't asked, or they're willing to take a more expansive look at what the threshold criteria are, or what the any other aspects that would allow them to build this view. And as you start looking afresh at each project and making fresh judgments which are in line with a new strategy or perceived new strategy, you start to see these types of views emerge. And this is not a bad thing at all. It's a great way to clean house and bring execution in line quickly with a new strategy. However, to ensure that the new leadership team doesn't fall prey to any of the same biases as their predecessors, we find it helpful to encourage the development of ongoing portfolio management, because what you really want to do is not just the one-time zombie culling, but build a capability to ensure they never get the chance to emerge in the first place. The second is the friends in high places pattern, where you see one or two lone projects that are frequently such extreme zombies, they've started to blend in with the woodwork. You see this in organizations where you've had leadership in roles for a few years, and where there's a high degree of autonomy granted to those leaders over their P&Ls. Essentially, pet projects get funding and protection, and the governance over the resource allocation process sometimes looks the other way or sees everything through rose-tinted and highly subjected lenses. We're all for lone innovators and visionary leaders finding creative ways to get resources, but you can never let projects become untouchable. So with that view, if you put it all together, you can start to see how a carefully crafted set of views can help a leadership team make better decisions. And obviously, depending on the exact portfolio you're managing, there will be different variations. And we've seen tens, if not hundreds of these different views, but they all tend to aggregate up under these three questions. Are we doing the right types of things? Are we doing enough of it? And are we optimizing how we allocate resources? So once you've asked those questions, you actually have to make decisions. This is our fourth and final step. We don't need to belabor this, except that to highlight that the chart on this page is one common way in which we frame the way in which decisions are made. And what we're trying to do when we often facilitate portfolio reviews or prepare for them is to ensure that you have a set of actions in each of these three categories: start, stop, and continue, right? A quick scan of the organization that was behind the creation of this chart would help explain the predicament. They'd fallen into many of the traps we discussed: a portfolio that was overly short-term, focused on adjacencies, versus looking out for really big opportunities in the future. And so you can see a set of recommendations that are consistent with that observation. They made a decision to create a watch list of projects with high revenue potential. They made a decision to proactively fill the pipeline with additional early stage projects. They made the decision to pivot 6 projects and shut down 7 others after their first type of analysis. And it's not uncommon for this type of analysis to immediately yield significant savings. We have seen 30, 40% cost savings across a portfolio of investment, which allows those dollars to be, flow directly to the bottom line, or be reinvested more efficiently, or be reinvested against new strategic and emerging priorities. So with that, the last comment, I promised earlier I would talk not just about portfolio analysis, but bring it back to portfolio management. Conducting a one-time analysis is a great way to get started, but the real power of portfolio management comes from embedding these questions into your existing processes for how decisions get made. It's all too common for innovation teams to get excited about portfolio management, stand up venture teams and venture boards, and all sorts of well-intentioned bureaucracy. But over the years, we've come to realize that this frequently leads to sort of a shadow bureaucracy within the organization, in which various groups that manage portfolios and allocate resources to innovation are disconnected from the real systems that actually define where funding should be allocated. So to do this, our approach starts with: what is your existing process for strategic planning, for budgeting, capital allocation, even things like your QBRs? And then we start to say, what are the questions that these governance teams and structures need to ask? And then we say, okay, what are the views that we can create and systematize so that we can routinely gather the right types of information and then insert that into the existing governance structure to drive better portfolio management. It's probably obvious to many of you, but the number of times we've walked into organizations who are considering the establishment of entirely new bureaucratic structures that really don't actually have the teeth and require much more substantial change management efforts is surprising. So with that, let me pass back to Dave just to wrap up here with a final recap, and maybe we'll have time for a question or two.
Yeah, well, you all can read the page yourselves, but these are the 4 steps that we've went through. And maybe just since we have a couple of minutes, we could take a couple of questions. I've been following these. There's a couple of themes that have popped up. One is, what if you have a project that doesn't neatly fit just one strategic priority, but it might cut across a few different ones? And that could be the case for technology and enabling technology, for example, as a project. That's certainly very common, and I think it's perfectly fine to map it to multiple different strategic priorities. And I make a broader point about that, which is that these charts don't magically kind of spit out the answer of exactly what to do. They're designed to give insight to a conversation, so leaders can then apply judgment, informed judgment as to portfolio decisions. So it's perfectly fine to split things or to put them in more than one place. Another great question that came up a few times is, what is a strategic priority? How do you define what those are? I have no idea how Alistair would answer this question. What I would say is, if you think about a strategy as being a set of choices about where you're going to play and how you're going to win, I think strategic priorities often fit into one of those categories. It might be about a where to play choice. We know we need to grow in Brazil and consumer banking, so we're going to put that on our map as something that we want to track and manage towards. Or it might be a how to win choice. We know we have to develop this capability around AI or something, and therefore that's a critical enabler of winning, and we're going to have to define that and track that as well.
Yeah, it certainly merits a whole webinar on the question of how do you interrogate an enterprise strategy to develop your innovation priorities. What is the role of innovation in supporting strategy? My final comment here would be, so often we find that innovation strategy is somewhat divorced from enterprise strategy, and you end up with this odd situation where senior leaders kind of don't need to prioritize innovation because they can actually deliver against all the goals they need to hit their annual compensation targets and to deliver the earnings that the company aspires to deliver. So we favor an approach which views the enterprise strategy innovation as very symbiotic, in which the enterprise innovation goals are necessary in order to deliver the long-term strategic enterprise goals. And as such, innovation now becomes something that is central to the long-term success of the organization, that takes away the risk of it becoming a nice to have, and then integrates investments in innovation and results from innovation directly into the core financial tracking and resource allocation parts of the firm. So with that, we are at time. We have taken a note of the questions. So Bogdan, Yash, Nathan, and others, we see your questions. We'll respond to each of those questions offline. We'll drop you an email note because they're all good questions and would happily follow up on those. But with that, thank you very much. We appreciate your time today. Appreciate you joining us, and hope to see you for future webinars.
Thanks.